Hey everybody, Michael here, and yeah, it's been a little bit since I've put a new part on our book reading series, so here we go. That's why I began our little video tonight with that puff of smoke from who knows where that came from. So, this is part 6. So, if this is the first one you click on, go back, find the other ones, and work your way up. Or not. Do what you want. Watch them this way and that. Because this book, it's each chapter kind of has its own thing. So, you can do that, if you want. But we're reading it through. So, part 6, and this is the beginning of chapter 4. So it took us 5 parts to get through 3 chapters, and that's I'm not surprised. It looks like each chapter is about 8 to 10 to 12 pages at most. So average weighs about probably 10 pages each. So that's pretty good. So we're going to continue right now. And chapter 4, okay, it's called The Shrub of Emotion, The Morsel of Thought. I love that. Good writing there. Old Martin Booth, may rest in peace. Alright, get centered here. Oh, y'all can't see my bird. Let's see if I can move it a little. There we go. Well, now you can't see my Kennedy hat. Oh, well. You already know I'm for Kennedy. Go, Bobby. So, anyway, this isn't a political video. This is about our wonderful, beloved plant. Those who love it like I do. The shrub of emotion, the morsel of thought. The Arabic world developed its own cannabis culture. And although not universally popular within Muslim societies, hashish in particular has played an important historical role. And see, that's a general statement. It's been on and off, depending on where you are and then what time, what period. And anyway, as you'll see here. In early Arabic texts, the term hashish referred not only to cannabis resin, but also to the dried leaves or flower heads and sweetmeats made with them. It was at the time eaten, not smoked. Well, at the time and that place. And that culture, When cannabis was first used as an intoxicant in the Arabic or Islamic world is open to conjecture. One legend states that an Indian pilgrim introduced it into Persia during the reign of the Sasanian Emperor Khosrow I from 531 to 579 AD. Other sources claim it was acquired from itinerant Chinese merchants or mendicants in the 7th century. One suggestion is that Wan Sang, a famous Chinese Buddhist scholar who visited the Punjab in or around 641 AD, was one of them. Another hypothesis has the knowledge of cannabis gained during one of the many military incursions made into the Indian subcontinent by the all-conquering Ghaznavid King Mahmud, the Muslim ruler of Afghanistan, from 998 to 1030 AD. The truth is likely to be less romantic. Cannabis was used medicinally across the Arabic world in Roman times, applied to a wide variety of ailments from migraines to syphilis, and as an analgesic and anesthetic. The great 9th century Islamic physician Razi's, also known more properly as Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria ar-Razi, prescribed it widely excuse me, A contemporary, the Arab physician Ibn Washiyah, warned of the potential effects of hashish, which he wrote was a lethal poison. What was more, the writings of Galen, Hippocrates, and Dioscorides had long been translated into Arabic and were widely available to scholars. Cannabis use, aside from the medicinal, spread across the Middle East with the expansion of the Islamic faith in the late 7th century. In part, it was passively promoted by the religion, for in the Quran, the faithful are specifically forbidden alcohol, but no prohibition is made of cannabis or its products. True. Muhammad, never. It's not in there. That its psychoactive properties were well known is indicated by the metaphors by which it was referred to in early Arabic texts. The bush of understanding, the shrub of emotion, the blissful branches, and the morsel of thought. All beautiful phrases, very descriptive. It is generally accepted that the use of hashish for what would nowadays be termed recreational purposes was well established in Arabic society by the 11th century and the subject of controversy amongst Islamic priests and scholars. Ibn Taymiyyah, 1263 to 1328, one of Islam's most important traditionalist theologians who was opposed to hashish use, damningly associated it with the accursed Mongols who had destroyed Baghdad in 1258. The main thrust of the argument lay in what Muhammad intended by prohibiting alcohol. The Quran, in parentheses 2, verse 219, I guess that would be, specifically prohibits intoxicants, gambling, the altars of idols, and games of chance. Now, see, you could argue if it's an intoxicant or not. Okay? Can be, but it's not that all the time for everybody. Not exactly. You know, not the same as other things that intoxicate people. Right? Alright, okay, so, the Quran does specifically prohibit intoxicants, gambling, the altars of idols, and games of chance. The word used for intoxicants, khamr, is open to interpretation. The root word from which this comes is the verb kamara, meaning to cover. The implication, therefore, is that any substance that covers the mind is sinful. The teaching adds that this prohibition includes the use of intoxicants in medicine. The morality of hashish imbibing in Islam is therefore somewhat ambiguous. Permissive Muslims argued, and still argue centuries later, that in forbidding wine, the Prophet was intending to stop the faithful from resorting to a substance that promoted violence, as can alcohol. Hashish, they maintained, induced pacificality, and did not truly intoxicate, and was therefore outside the Prophet's restriction. Furthermore, doctors declared it was a valuable analgesic. Much less dangerous than the other narcotic commonly used, opium. Yeah, it's a whole other ball game. Okay, a whole other plant, a whole other chemical structure compounds. A whole other thing. Okay. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. To comply with the prophet's wishes, Muslim doctors attempted to establish a dose of hashish that killed pain but did not intoxicate. Like a microdose, as we would call it today. The dice were loaded against hashish. The imams justifiably dreaded the thought that prayers might be offered to Allah while the supplicant was intoxicated. Intoxicated. See? The upper subjective. That's a subjective thing. Yeah. The upper classes supported the ban not only on the grounds that it was sinful, but also because it threatened to undermine the labor force. Arabic civil laws questioned whether a divorce pronouncement was deemed legal if issued whilst the husband was under the influence of hashish, while it was also forbidden to feed cannabis plants to animals unless to fatten them up. There was an exception. The mystical Sufi Muslims. Sufis. Look into them. They're very interesting. I have a couple books on them I've had since I was a teenager, and their Sufism is it's a minor sect branch of Islam that's very different than the others in their beliefs and everything. So yeah, look into them. Very interesting group. I know also another group that's sidelined to that in the Islamic world. It's a minority group like that, similar that they're almost died out now. Is the whirling dervishes, and they are, I think, Sufis as well. They regard themselves as Sufis, Sufi Muslims, but it's a certain subdivision of it. Anyway, very interesting stuff. If you're interested in religion and other religions and things like that, you might not be familiar with. It's those groups are very interesting within Islam. So, okay, let's get back to it. So there was an exception. The mystical Sufi Muslims are really interesting. Kind of hippie-ish, sort of, that vibe. Believe spiritual enlightenment was attainable through a state of ecstasy or altered consciousness and used hashish specifically for that purpose. To them, hashish was sacramental, a portal through which to commune directly with Allah, and therefore not a substance to be regarded lightly. They respected, Hadar, its supposed discoverer, in the Islamic legends and world, history. Had warned his disciples to keep it from the ignorant for fear they would abuse it. Yet the secret was not kept. It is said, as he was dying, Hadar requested cannabis be planted round his grave, and through this, pilgrims learnt of it, spreading the knowledge of it. Additionally, the Sufi poets, whose mystical didactic verse is central to Islamic literature, referred to cannabis infusions as the cup of Hadar. It is hardly surprising, with such publicity, the secret leaked out. Sufis were not looked upon kindly by mainstream Islam. Okay? That's why some of these minority sects, what we call denominations, pretty interesting sometimes. Even though, you don't have to subscribe to things to be curious and be interested in these groups. And yeah, I kind of appreciate how courageous it is to be an adherent to a minority sect of any of these religions. It's tough, but is what it is. So Haydar requested cannabis be planted around his grave, and through this, pilgrims learned of it, spreading knowledge. Additionally, the Sufi poets, whose mystical verses central to Islamic literature, referred to cannabis infusions as the cup of Haydar. It is hardly surprising with such publicity the secret leaked out. Sufis, sorry, I read that twice. Sorry. Sufis were not looked upon kindly by mainstream Islam. As the Albigensians were to Christianity, so were the Sufis to other Muslims. Their form of worship, Sufism, was regarded as a deviant religious movement. Their members were existentialists who lived an ascetic communal life of self-denial, dressed differently from other Muslims, and used hashish. They were seen as dissidents and subversives, challenging orthodox theology and claiming a direct communication with Allah. For this, they were, and in some places still are, reviled within Islam. Every Sufi considered by Orthodox Islam as being of lower moral standards and classed as a mulhida, or heretic. Well, don't brush with the too big of a brush on the, not all Sunnis and Shiites are gonna think that way. Don't, maybe some, maybe it's prevailing or was prevailing thought, but and still maybe with some, but not everybody. Don't say all of them. But yeah. Like I said in a previous part of this, Islam seems to be more tolerant of the minority groups within, or at least the dominant ones, the Sunnis and the Shias, both have kind of been, there's still Sufis around. There's still maybe a few million Sufis, and continue on, and there's a lot of denominations within other religions through time that didn't continue because of the parts of that religion crushed them down and destroyed them completely. And so at least we still have Sufis and whirling dervishes and those types of interesting things in Islam. And Hinduism is also good in that way as well, with all of their different sects and subdivisions. And there's a bunch. It's pretty complex once you start looking into Hinduism. Fascinating, And see, we can look into these things and appreciate these things, research, and use that for your own enlightenment purposes. And no matter what you're going to believe what you're going to believe, you're going to be the sum total of all the things that you've taken in and all of the things your parents instilled in you and the way you were raised and maybe the ways you rebelled against that and so many things. So anyway, I get off on tangents. I'm sorry. There was more to this proscription than theological dislike. Sufis were usually from the lower working class strata of society. A religion that catered specifically for them was sure to be denounced. That the poor used hashish and that the religion used it for heretical purposes only further drove them into cultural isolation and religious persecution. Hashish was considered the vehicle of their fall from the grace of Allah. It was seen to weaken their resolve, both physically and spiritually. They were regarded as lazy misfits who failed to play their part in a conservative society that was based on conformity. Amongst Sufi society, initiates were referred to as hashishiyah, users of hashish. It was to become a derogatory term of abuse in the rest of Islam, the rest of the Islamic world, you could say. at that time, those times. Thought of almost as outlaws and certainly often as common criminals, Sufis nevertheless contributed much to Islamic learning. Yeah, there's a lot of positives about these people. Sa'ad od-Din Mahmud Shabastari was one of Islam's greatest poets, whilst Abd al-Qadir al-Jilani was a great evangelist who regarded Sufism as a personal jihad, or holy struggle, against the inner will. Al-Ghazali, a Sufi theologian who did much towards making Sufism acceptable to Orthodox Muslims, was a close friend of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, the most famous physician and scientist in early Islam. Nevertheless, Orthodox Islam wanted hashish banned. That orthodoxy, I tell you, all the orthodoxies are, you know. Okay, Sufism, or to give it its correct name, oh Lordy help me, Tasawwuf, meaning to wear wool, first began to arise in the late 7th century AD. As it developed, it increasingly came under attack from Orthodox Islam and increasingly disseminated itself over the Arabic world, taking with it its use of hashish. Let me just stop. I'll put my finger there. Let me just say, 7th century. That's the 600 ADs, y'all. 7th century. That's contemporary, or just after, the life of Muhammad himself. Muhammad was in the 600s AD. I don't know the top of my head his years, but his lifetime was within that century, the 600s AD, the 7th century. Well, Sufism started right then. Very interesting. It could very well be, it has a root that goes right to the origin of Islam itself, which is Muhammad, that's right at that time. So we're talking right then or just right after Muhammad was was gone. So very interesting. I didn't realize that, or I didn't remember that myself, that it coincided with it right then. So as it developed, it increasingly came under the history. Wait, I got to sorry. Increasingly disseminated itself over the Arabic world, taking with it its use of hashish. So the Sufis went, used it. By the mid-13th century, so we're in the 1200s AD, the mid-13th century, there was a substantial Sufi population in Cairo. The community centered itself upon the gardens overlooking the Khalig, which had been built by Abu al-Miskafur, an Ethiopian slave and advisor to the Ikhshidid dynasty, who was the de facto ruler of 10th century Egypt. Here they conversed, conducted their religious services, took hashish, and grew cannabis. In 1253, the authorities, considering the Sufis a threat to public order, raided the gardens, uprooted all the cannabis plants, and burned them on a pyre, the smoke visible for miles. Doesn't that sound familiar to more modern times? We're talking in 1253 that happened to the Sufis. You could kind of think of them as a more original hippie movement. They were communal. They had a lot in common, I'm telling you. And you look into them, And also kind of like the sadhus of India, but not quite the same of extreme asceticism as the sadhus live by in India. but similar in some ways too. It's a minority group on the outskirts of the orthodoxy. But in India it's a little different because sadhus are more kind of respected, even though they're more wild and more ascetic. um, they're revered more by by the whole of Hinduism. You'll see wealthy bankers and wealthy businessmen in their nice suits, multi-thousand-dollar suits, and they will walk in India and they'll see a sadhu sitting there almost naked with just a towel around, a little wrap around him, and a wrap around his head and nothing else, and then him sitting there probably dusty and everything else. And that fancy businessman, in a way, it's almost like going and confessing your sins to a priest in Catholicism. They kind of will, no matter what status you are in society, that it's part of a Hindu kind of belief system to lower yourself in front of that sadhu and that wild man, that ascetic that's living outside of the caste system, that's living outside of the society. And they're special. They're looked at as special in India, or they used to. They still are to an extent. It's still a continual thing. And they are very wild. There's different groups of them. Sadhus is a general term. There's all different groups. Okay? Not all of them smoke pot either. A lot of them do. I would say most of the sadhus sex do. But some of them don't. Some of them don't eat hardly anything. Some of them try to starve themselves. Some of them go without. Some of them do all kinds of crazy stuff. So there's all different groups of them. But in general, my story, to display what I'm saying is that wealthy businessman, he could be a billionaire if he was walking down the street in a market or something in New Delhi or Mumbai, and he sees that sadhu sitting there in a corner or very humble, very barefoot, hardly anything on, and he might be sitting there smoking big chillum or just singing or doing something like that, or just sitting there and smiling and blessing people as they walk by. There's a variety of things that they could be doing. But the thing that's interesting to me the most is that wealthy person, that wealthy man, that wealthy woman will go up to them, and without really having to converse much, because it's like understood. It's understood, that for example, that man may, maybe not all the time, sometimes maybe just do something other than this, but an old display of respect would be to usually the sadhu would sit there with a bowl. One of the most useful things when you're kind of a homeless person is having a nice bowl. So they have a bowl, and of course put money into and stuff like that. But there'll be a bowl usually and some water, or just a pitcher of water or something. There'll be water somewhere, or the wealthy person might have something, or go find something and bring it, and make a point of it, just randomly, like synchronicity wise, like, oh, I stumbled upon this guy today walking down this street and never seen him before, or maybe I did, but you know what I mean. Either way, they'll take that water and they'll go wash this sadhu's feet. They will wash the man's feet. Usually, if they have some rags or whatever, they'll pour the water. It's more of a symbolic thing, but they'll pour the water on the man's feet. Of course, the man will let them. The man knows what's up. The man will, he'll sit there and stick his legs out, stick his feet out, or stand up or sit and have this wealthy elitist person come and stoop down, bend down, kneel down in front of them, with them, sit down with them, just whatever scenario. Just a sign of dignity and respect that this is a special person here that I've come across in my day to day. And I need to do this. They feel compelled, like in other religions, right? Try to see the parallels, So, so they'll wash the man's feet, or they'll do something like that for the man. And then they will kind of bow or kneel or sit there with them and bow their heads and ask for prayer, ask for blessing. And it's very special to that person, and may give them some alms or not. But, yeah. And then he gets up and goes about his way. And Sadhu's there with cleaner feet than he had before. That wealthy man walked his way. Alright, let's see where we were. Yes. $12.53. The authorities, considering the Sufi a threat to public order, raided the gardens, uprooted all the cannabis plants, and burned them on a pyre, the smoke visible for miles. Thereafter, the Sufis raised their crop out in the Nile Valley. Local farmers only too pleased to oblige them for a fee. This status quo lasted until 1324, when the authorities organized a purge throughout the countryside. Troops destroying all the cannabis plants they discovered. DEA much. For a while, there was a hashish shortage. Then business picked up again as the next crop came to maturity. Now, wise to the risks, the farmers in turn bribed local officials to turn a blind eye. 54 years later, in 1378, the Ottoman emir in Egypt, Sudun Shekuni, determined to stamp out hashish use. Instigated martial law. Crops were burned to the ground. So were farms and villages. Farmers were imprisoned or executed, and those found guilty of consuming hashish were said to have had their teeth pulled. 5 years on, it was as if nothing had happened. Hashish had become an integral part of Arab life and would not be suppressed. So it's like no matter what they did, kept going. It was sold and consumed openly. Officials, many of whom used it themselves, accepted bribes to ignore law enforcement, not only because this was a source of additional income, crooked income, as well as intoxication, but also because they were tacitly in favor of it. When the authorities did from time to time clamp down, it was with severe measures. But this did nothing to reduce the drug's popularity. And I would argue, if anything, it probably made it even, every time they attacked it, just grew even more. Sound familiar? More modern times. Things are in a cycle. History's not in a line. It's not from A to B in a linear fashion. No. The Eastern thought has it right about that. The more Eastern thought. Time is cyclical, people. So 1378. Sounds familiar for a reason. For a real reason. Things go around and around like that. Until we learn from it, things will repeat, sometimes. That's why we got to find our patience. hashish, so it was very popular after that. It was not in the Arab world. It was not only in the souks, bazaars, and coffee shops that hashish was prevalent. It was widely mentioned in the Arabic literature of the time. In his book, The Herb, Hashish versus Medieval Muslim Society, published in 1971, the Arabic scholar Franz Rosenthal remarked that he thought there could hardly have been an Arabic poet writing between the 13th and 16th centuries who did not refer to it. To the ordinary reader in the non-Arabic world, one of the most famous pieces of Arab literature is the collection of stories written between 1000 and 1700 and entitled The Thousand and One Nights, or Arabian Nights. I have a copy of it. Comes all in one book, and there's multiple stories. It's almost like a more advanced Mother Goose sort of book, but whoa, that's amazing. Aladdin comes from there. Um, Scheherazade is the main character in it. No, I've read some. I haven't read it all. I've read some of the stories. They're really good. They're all different. Very interesting. And yeah, he's saying they're from 1000 to 1700. I think some of them, and they are Arab literature, and like the most well known outside of Islam, as far as the literature. Yeah, I think some of it, even including the Aladdin story, is older than that. Is older than 1000 AD. 1000 to 1700, that's quite a gap. That's 700-year gap for a book that you can get all in one book. It has all the stories in it. 700 years for all of those to be written and then be put in a book. I think the Arabian Nights as a book, the 1001 Nights, is probably as a group of stories dates back to, probably 1000 AD. As a group, as a book already, as a grouping already. That's what I feel. I don't have any evidence of it. If you read some of it, I think some of it might even have been adopted by the Islamic writers or copiers, kind of like the Brothers Grimm did later on. That it came from earlier things and pre-Muslim sources of literature, and then it was adapted to Islam, and yes, revised. They revised the old stuff and made it more, inserted the Islamic stuff within the stories that were older stories than Islam itself. And yes, of course, we have Easter with the Easter bunny in Christianity. So yeah, that happens in all the religions, right? You have previous things, and then the new religion comes and kind of takes it and inserts things in it. But by doing that, even though they've changed it some, and it'd be nice to have the originals still before it was altered by the new religions. But at least we have it in some form, whereas it may have been lost otherwise completely if they hadn't have inserted their stuff. Okay. Oh, double-edged swords. All around. Alright, I'm going to have to stop this soon. Let me read a little bit more so we can get back into the actual friggin' book. 1001 Nights. I just love those stories. Very good. Hashish features particularly in these stories the tale of the second captain of police. I don't remember that one. The tale of the two hashish eaters. And the tale of the hashish eater. In the latter, a beggar stands on a nail and cuts his foot. To wash it clean, he enters a hammam or Turkish bath. As he tends his foot, a fellow bather offers him some hashish, which he eats. Immediately he is filled with hilarity, then collapses into a deep sleep. He dreams he is attended by masseurs before being taken to his bride. In a separate chamber, a young boy leads in a girl, little more than a child, into whose hand he places his you know what. At this moment, he feels terribly cold and wakes to find himself surrounded by laughing bathers, some of them emptying jugs of cold water over him. He is holding his... I didn't know this was graphic like this. Sorry, I forgot this whole part. Lord mercy. He's... this is old literature, folks. Just remember that. And I'm not for censorship at all, so... But, I don't want to say certain words, it's not the topic of discussion here. So, so he is holding himself, and it is made clear he has been doing stuff with himself, okay? Much to the amusement of those present, who ask him why he is not ashamed to have been fornicating with the air whilst under the influence of hashish. Such an image of the drug debasing its user was a common theme. Propaganda much, even for that time? Except in mystical Sufi literature, of course. They wouldn't do that. By the end of the 16th century, with the arrival of tobacco from the New World, the craze for smoking swept through Europe and on into the Middle East. Hashish, until then eaten, started to be smoked instead. Tobacco smoking, which was soon recognized to be addictive, introduced the concept of burning dried vegetable material as a means of acquiring the drug content. And as tobacco smoking quickly spread across Europe and North Africa and into the Middle East and Asia, the smoking of cannabis followed. It was like a resurgence. I look at it as, cycles. That this was that cycle coming back. It wasn't the first. But it was making a loop around again. It was, coming a more worldwide phenomenon. Again. Remember the Scythians of a previous chapter? Yeah, long ago, long before this part. Yeah. So, and they were spreading it too. So, smoking of cannabis followed. I think we're going to end there. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to mark it right there so I know exactly where it is. We about got through the chapter. Did pretty good. We got like 3 pages. Yeah. 3 or 4 pages left in this chapter. Next chapter, I'll save that for the next part because we'll finish up this chapter, which was the shrub of emotion, the morsel of thought. We're going to finish that off. Hope you enjoyed it so far. Each chapter is kind of its own thing here, But then once you get through a few, you start seeing things like the cyclical patterns, that we're already starting to see. So, yeah, because we're, roughly around the, he kind of slowly eases his way up through time, even though he backtracks too sometimes and loops back. He does generally go through the book, going through, like a history book usually does. So, right now we're kind of roughly in the 12 to 1300s. And then every now and then going back to 600-700s, as we're in the Islamic period here in this chapter. And the next chapter might go back. I'm not sure. I don't remember. We'll see. I'm not going to look forward. I only look forward to the next chapter. That's it. And just the title of it. I don't read it. And I'm not going to read the head. I don't read ahead. That's why I mark it with my pencil and then I close the book. Y'all have a good evening, and yeah, 45 minutes. Well, I can sure make a longer one, can't I? Doesn't even, not much effort to it. Sitting here reading and telling you what I think about certain things while I read to you. So, y'all have a nice night, or evening, night, and bless you, and I will see y'all later.